Miquella is going to use us to complete his metamorphosis and ascent to godhood. At least I'll be attempting to provide evidence to support this theory of mine for what our role as Tarnished and Miquella's role might be in the Shadow of the Erdtree DLC for Elden Ring. This channel is expanding to lore and theory videos for 2024 in addition to the Elden Ring builds that I've previously been known for, but I'm just gonna wait until the new DLC items come out to make new builds with. However, returning viewers might have seen my Messmer is a hero video, which was my first ever real lore and theory video. In that video, I provided context found within the base game of Elden Ring and in the new trailer to support the fact that Messmer's character might be more noble than what his appearance suggests. Surprisingly, this was met with an overwhelmingly positive reception, but there's always room for me to improve. So I wanted to acknowledge my frequent mistakes like embarrassing mispronunciations of names or locations, and thank you to those who were able to look past it and see the bigger picture. But in that video, I also stated Messmer was a hero and that he would be a hero in the same way that the other demigods were heroes too. This is partially correct, but I forgot to specify and left out that the demigod heroes of Elden Ring all eventually had their noble traits warped or degraded in some way, which was gradual more than instantaneous. In an effort to improve and gather a more informed opinion, I spoke with Smotown via direct messages, and you should definitely check out their channel in the description if for some reason you haven't by now, because it's mainly thanks to their dedication and research that I'm able to make this video today. But we had a nice conversation, and they even verified that they held the same belief for Messmer's character and mentioned it in their initial video, summarizing it as, the demigods all believe that they are the good guys, and sometimes starting out with noble intentions, but often becoming warped basically. Their main example of this heroic trait degradation referred to a video by Radahn, and this video was from a series on the demigods' heroic concepts that discusses how all demigods have something redeemable about them, or at least heroic, as stated by Miyazaki in a pre-release interview. But over time in the game's events, the good or heroic traits in these demigods have been gradually warped to some degree. In their example, even someone like Rykard had heroism of his own, which was rebellion and rejection that became hunger and greed. Radahn's loyalty became stagnation, or his inability to let things go and accept change, such that Radahn would rather bend the laws of physics to stay on his withering horse Leonard instead of just getting a better horse, or even more drastically, hold all the stars in the sky in place, so that the fate of the lands would never change. And it's likely that Messmer would follow suit with his own noble trait that over time would be warped, which fits what Miyazaki meant by Messmer being a hero, and thankfully still holds up my initial theory, and how Messmer might have had a heroism of his own as well, which would later become warped to the point that it resulted in Messmer setting the land ablaze. What exactly Messmer's ideals might be are unclear at this time, but I just wanted to amend some parts of my previous Messmer video, and will fully revisit him in my next video, so make sure to subscribe if you're new here, as I hope to focus on the larger part of the DLC today that I believe to be Miquella. Let's start off with a refresher on Miquella's lore, and in my opinion, the most important facts we already know of that can be found within the base game of Elden Ring. Miquella is a demigod who is the twin sibling of Malenia. Both of them were born from a single god, e.g. Marika and Radahn. This is speculated to be the reason that they are both inflicted with a curse in the first place. Malenia is very obviously cursed with scarlet rot, and Miquella's curse being a bit more vague, stating he was cursed with eternal childhood or youth, but not much besides that. At some point, Malenia and Miquella were selected during the Age of the Erdtree by their own two fingers to be candidates to succeed their mother Marika. This is because they are Empyreans, which are special beings that are capable of becoming gods of a new age and forging a new order that governs the world. In his initial youth, Miquella was actually quite fond of his family, Marika, Radahn, and their Golden Order fundamentalism. Or at least this is a strong implication that can be found through Miquella's spells that he created for the Golden Order, clearly showing that at some point he had faith in the Erdtree and frequently practiced it enough to create these spells. Even Miquella's father, Radahn, created a spell for his son out of gratitude, to show how proud Radahn was of Miquella and his son's dedication to the Order. Both spells from Miquella or Radahn can be seen as a sign of respect for one another, and at the very least, Radahn, Miquella, and the Golden Order had a healthy relationship for a time. Miquella's faith would soon come to a halt, as Miquella would search within the Golden Order and the Erdtree's healing powers to find a cure for his sister's scarlet rot. To their dismay, no matter how much Miquella kept his faith and practiced the Golden Order, both the Erdtree Erdtree and the Golden Order could do nothing to cure Malenia of her curse. This is a huge pivotal point in the lore that I believe can be confirmed through these item descriptions, and provides key context for the motivations of Malenia and Miquella that come long after. Miquella would only lose faith in the Erdtree as a result of Marika's Golden Order not being able to cure his sister. He clearly harbored no ill will towards the Golden Order before this, as both him and his father were on respectable terms, and that Miquella practiced his faith in the Erdtree extensively by being able to create these spells. Only after the Golden Order failed him did Miquella peacefully decide to part ways and embark on his new journey. Miquella's Hailgtree was located far out of sight of the capital and the Erdtree, which can be suggestive that he didn't want his mother to find out that he was challenging their Golden Order. This Hailgtree was watered with his own blood since it was a sapling. Smotown makes a very great point that this sapling was likely a minor Erdtree from a golden seed, as can be seen through visual storytelling by the Erdtree avatars and ulcerated tree spirits that only ever spawn around these.
We still find Erdtree avatars here, defending the Hailgtree. Now let's look at the staff of the avatar, the weapon that the avatars wield. It reads as follows: ceremonial staff depicting the Erdtree in its historic radiance, wielded by the avatars who protect the minor Erdtrees.
Miquella's Hailgtree ultimately failed to become an Erdtree, and it's important to make this distinction that Miquella tried to grow this minor Erdtree sapling into a fully grown Erdtree, just like the one in the capital. But he never actually succeeded, nor is it even clearly stated that this was possible. However, I'm of the belief that Miquella knew exactly what he was doing would be successful, and I'm going to provide some reasons as to why. I stated earlier that Miquella watered this Hailgtree with his own blood, and he would likely only do this if he knew it was possible to achieve his end goal of a fully grown Erdtree. It seems like a very specific step to use his own Empyrean blood for it to just be guesswork. But if that doesn't sell you on that idea, in Malenia's Winged Helm item description, it explicitly mentions Miquella possessing the wisdom of a god, which contextually is an attribute surpassing his current demigod status. This insight goes beyond relative intelligence among demigods, placing Miquella closer to the capabilities of an actual god. Despite Miquella's youthful appearance and lack of notable physical strength, his exceptional intellect would be more evident, specifically in his dedication to the Golden Order's fundamentalism. This dedication to create new incantations involved a level of intellectual ability embedded into his faith in the Erdtree, which is evident in the Golden Order seal scaling with both faith and intelligence. Given Miquella's intellectual prowess and his understanding of the Golden Order's principles, it's plausible that he developed the knowledge necessary to the successful transformation of his Hailgtree into an actual Erdtree. Further reinforcing Miquella's evident wisdom and lack of physical prowess is the designation of Malenia as the Blade of Miquella. This moniker implies a protective or instrumental role, suggesting that Malenia serves either as Miquella's guardian or as the muscle supporting his plans, and both can even be seen as true here. In either scenario, this would mean that to some extent, Miquella could not do everything in his plans without Malenia, which we'll get into more in a bit. But Malenia noted that Miquella is the most fearsome of all Empyreans. This would include putting Miquella above herself in all aspects that don't involve raw strength. Instead, Miquella's power appears to stem from a source beyond mere physical might, and that this is what is fearsome to Malenia more than her strength as someone who has never known defeat. Again, Miquella's fearsome potential and knowledge can be showcased through his crafting of incantations, intricate manipulation of unalloyed gold that possesses the power to ward off the influence of the outer gods, like halting Malenia's scarlet rot infection or cleansing away the frenzied flame. It's likely that Miquella even noticed the fractures and shortcomings within the Golden Order far before it actually collapsed. Considering these facts, it becomes reasonable to infer that Miquella, possessing such wisdom and foresight, might have known that creating an Erdtree from his blood was possible, rather than relying on speculative trial and error. This is why I'm of the belief that Miquella would have easily known that making his own Erdtree from a Hailgtree was in fact possible, and that his Erdtree could either cure his sister of her rot curse, or at the very least the Erdtree would play an important role in his metamorphosis into a true god, and might allow him to create a cure for her scarlet rot by himself. However, it was during this process that Miquella would need to enshroud his body within a cocoon located at the bottom of his Hailgtree, which was guarded by Malenia, a cocoon being directly symbolic of metamorphosis and parallels with the nascent butterfly, which we know represents Miquella, and this butterfly states that it just emerged from its cocoon and looks like it was in there for its entire life. This can signify that Miquella was going to go in the cocoon a demigod and come out of the cocoon a true god, and all of this would only happen if everything went according to plan, which we know it did not. Sir Gideon even states that he even heard speculation of Miquella embedding himself into the Hailgtree.
So, the Hailgtree, now but a husk. I heard speculation Miquella embedded himself in the Hailgtree, but before he could finish, someone cut the tree open and absconded with his infant form.
This is what Gideon says after we defeat Malenia and confirm that both the Hailgtree has been contaminated and is decaying with scarlet rot, and that Malenia was defending the area where Miquella and his cocoon were embedded, but someone took him away during this process of his metamorphosis. This is important context because Malenia would never leave Miquella's side unless she had a good reason. As I'm sure you've heard 1,000 times by now,
I am Malenia, Blade of Miquella, and I have never known defeat.
Malenia is the Blade of Miquella, which signifies that in some way, Miquella needed her strength to do what he could not. This leads us to the reason she fought Radahn in the first place. I should preface this by saying this specific part is up to speculation, as there are a few implications but no direct confirmation as to why Radahn and Malenia were even fighting, or what they were fighting over in the first place. But I'm of the belief that Miquella was already late in the metamorphosis process before Mohg ever stole him out of the Hailgtree. This could be supported by the fact that Malenia said she awaited his return.
Corpse after corpse left in my wake as I awaited his return.
This can mean two main things. Either she didn't know where Miquella was, as in she had no clue Mohg took him away and she could do nothing but be hopeful and wait for his return, or she knew Miquella had already separated from his body to an extent, so it didn't matter if he was taken or not, as even if his body was still here, she would still be waiting for his metamorphosis to complete anyways. It's even possible to consider both statements to be true. We know that Mohg was the one who stole Miquella away from his Hailgtree, which is why the Hailgtree would end up withering away, since it no longer had Miquella's blood to keep it growing, in addition to the fact that after Malenia's fight with Radahn, she could no longer hold back the scarlet rot as she intentionally unleashed it in a desperate attempt to best Radahn in her duel. And this would soon cause her scarlet rot to overflow and corrupt the Hailgtree from where we meet her in the deepest parts of its roots, causing the entire Hailgtree to absorb an abundance of rot. However, this fight between Malenia and Radahn ended in a stalemate, which can be confirmed by Gideon, as Radahn survived but gradually lost his sanity, turning into a monster, and Malenia had to be dragged back in an unconscious state to the Hailgtree by Cleanrot Finlay, as mentioned in Finlay's description. This fight with Radahn is extremely important because it's likely when Mohg saw an opportunity to sneak into the Hailgtree and take Miquella's cocoon back to Mohgwyn's palace, where Mohg would then preemptively open it in hopes that he might be able to corrupt the metamorphosis process to create a god of blood instead. I don't believe it's too important to go into the specific details here on what Mohg was trying to achieve, just more important that whatever it was failed, because Miquella had likely separated his soul from his body before then. However, this is still missing an explanation as to why Malenia wasn't there to keep Mohg away in the first place, or at least why Malenia would ever leave Miquella's side. Even if Miquella was in a cocoon or partially ascended and left his body behind, reason stands to suggest that Malenia of all people would still feel the need to watch over him, unless he told her not to. For this part of my conjecture, I strongly believe that Malenia would only ever leave Miquella's side if she knew he would be fine without her, or if he ordered her to do something else, which I think is the most likely of the two. Going back to the Blade of Miquella nickname that Malenia has, she was either his protector or the enforcer of his will and plans. She would never leave to go fight Radahn for something as simple as an ego battle, or just to take his great rune from him. Malenia likely needed to defeat Radahn as an important step to help aid in Miquella's metamorphosis process. Otherwise, I believe she would have never left his side. If Malenia were to stay by Miquella's cocoon the whole time, it can be argued that Miquella's metamorphosis would likely not be able to finish in its process, and that this could be the driving purpose towards her leaving his side in the first place. Most of us should already know that Radahn held the stars in place with his gravitational powers, and that Miquella likely required Radahn to release his grip on the stars to complete his metamorphosis in some way. But why am I suggesting that the Blade of Miquella would be sent on this southbound march from the Hailgtree to Radahn, all for an attempt to get him to release the stars? After all, what purpose would Miquella even have in needing the stars to move freely once again? Why would Miquella want this? And why would he request Malenia to kill his own half-brother to achieve this? Well, it's plausible that through Radahn's heroic trait of loyalty, which degraded into stagnation, that Radahn would not simply release his grip on the stars just because he was asked to. We can infer through Miquella's intellect and wisdom that Miquella would be aware of this and know that Radahn would not comply as well. This is why I'm of the belief that Malenia went to fight Radahn per Miquella's request, or at the least on his behalf, such that Radahn being dead was the only way to get the stars to move again, and this appears to be needed in some way for Miquella's plan, which I actually have a pretty good reason for why Miquella would need the stars to move and how the stars play an important role in some part of his plan. We also know that Miquella, despite not being a stargazer like the Carians or Glintstone sorcerers, has studied the sky, its stars, and even the moon to an extensive amount, where it's possible to assume that he would know the limits or the potential powers that the stars inhibit. This can be inferred by his golden epitaph, which implies that Miquella as a young boy mourned the death of his half-brother Godwyn, who was the first of the demigods to be slain, dying in spirit but alive in body. It's likely that Miquella initially hoped Godwyn's body could be put to rest, but Miquella's empathy, as we know, would lead him to explore another option of restoration, by studying the stars and the moon to create an eclipse. In Elden Ring, eclipses are speculated to contain the power to restore a soulless demigod back to life. It's unclear whether it's the sole purpose of an eclipse, but the general idea is that the people of Castle Sol seem to believe in this, and that when the moon eclipses the sun, it would somehow drain the sun of its energy, and that this energy could be harnessed to restore a soulless demigod back to life. This is loosely referenced by the eclipse shuttle, which is a ceremonial item depicting the sun that was eclipsed by a moon and then drained of its color, which its drained color could likely signify that the energy of the sun has been absorbed or transferred elsewhere. Whether or not this transfer of sun energy to restore a demigod back to life was possible is unclear, but I take this as an important stepping stone that Miquella learned a lot from these people, and that he would have learned even more about the power of the stars being involved in the process of an eclipse. Miquella is even directly tied to Castle Sol via a spirit who mentions him in his Hailgtree by name. The only evidence of an eclipse from Castle Sol restoring life to a soulless demigod clearly failed as mentioned by this spirit, but it puts me under the impression that this is when and how Miquella gained vast knowledge over the stars and their powers or limitations. Maybe it was possible to restore a demigod with the power of the sun, but that this was only a small step in a much larger process. This could have been a revelation to Miquella, and that he would learn from this experience that the stars somehow played a significant part in his metamorphosis into a god much later. But Radahn's role here means that an eclipse could never take place without Radahn's approval. Malenia would make a southbound march to confront Radahn and get him to release his grip on the stars, likely as a crucial step in Miquella's plan. As stated earlier, Radahn was always loyal to the point where it ended up warping into a resistance to change, which is why we can assume he would never willingly agree to stop his grip on the stars just because Malenia or Miquella kindly asked him to. So it can be a logical assumption that the reason Malenia and Radahn fought was over the control of the stars. Radahn fighting for his resistance to change, Malenia fighting on Miquella's behalf as the Blade of Miquella, and freeing the stars from Radahn's grasp by force. Again, this is assuming that the stars moving play an important role in altering the fate or the metamorphosis process that I suggested Miquella learned through those experiments with solar eclipses. These are all the supporting reasons why I believe Miquella would desire the stars freely moving, why Malenia fought Radahn in the first place to support Miquella's plan of needing the stars to move once again, and how Mohg ever had an opportunity to steal Miquella away from his Hailgtree. As I stated earlier, it wouldn't make much sense for Malenia to leave her precious and defenseless twin in an extremely vulnerable state, unless she specifically knew Miquella had either already partially ascended or had to leave the Hailgtree per his request. And again, both can be seen as true here. It would be the perfect scenario to leave Miquella alone in his cocoon if Malenia knew his soul had already left his body to some degree, and if Miquella needed Malenia to force Radahn to allow the stars to move again to complete this process. To put it very briefly, Mohg was just an obsessed power-hungry weirdo that defiled a corpse in hopes of corrupting the process to form his own god of blood. But little did Mohg know that Miquella had divested himself of his own flesh, likely long before that point, which means Mohg was just fiddling with a corpse and achieved nothing as a result. We can make this assumption of Malenia knowing that Miquella was far along in his metamorphosis and ascent to godhood, and that she knowingly chose to not defend Miquella's cocoon as his body was something Miquella wasn't spiritually attached to. We can infer that Malenia was only defending Miquella's body and cocoon for him to return to, but she never would have expected Mohg of all people to even know where Miquella was located, as the Hailgtree was well hidden, so far away that even people who knew of and supported its existence would likely be unsuccessful to their pilgrimage here unless they were directly shown the way, like how Loretta guided the Albinarics, or how the people in Castle Sol could literally see the Hailgtree from their castle, but even then lamented not being given the chance to visit the Hailgtree despite their devotion and worship towards it. But how could Mohg know of this secret area? How would he know when the time was right to strike, since it seems like these stars had to align, no pun intended, for Malenia to ever leave Miquella's side? Well, despite the Hailgtree being physically disconnected on a peninsula, and being inaccessible even to those who supported Miquella's new order, who knew of its existence but could never reach it, Mohg successfully stealing Miquella's cocoon while Malenia left to fight Radahn represents that Mohg somehow knew of this secret area and would know exactly when Malenia left. It can be assumed that Mohg carefully waited for the right chance to strike. Mohg would likely know of this thanks to his invisible sanguine nobles that appear to be stalking the area of the consecrated snowfield, and even have a direct portal to Mohgwyn's palace in this location. I'm doubtful that this was their sole purpose of inhabiting the consecrated snowfield, but I believe it's plausible to suggest that if Malenia ever left the Hailgtree without Miquella for some reason, like how I'm suggesting she went to fight Radahn on Miquella's behalf to free the stars as an important step in Miquella's ascent to godhood, Mohg of all people would be the first to know that Miquella was no longer being guarded by Malenia. Now, this was all just context from the game and partially my conjecture of it. But this next section features mostly my theories based on the facts and context that I hope I was able to provide to support the following things I believe in. Which again is, number 1, Miquella had the wisdom to know the stars played some significant part in his ascent to godhood. Number 2, Malenia would only leave Miquella defenseless because she knew he was far along in his ascent and left his body already, and because she needed to kill Radahn to allow the stars to move again, reaffirming point number 1. And lastly, number 3, that Mohg took this as his opportunity to steal Miquella and his cocoon back to Mohgwyn's palace, where we see it to be in Mohg's boss fight room. And also, if number 1 and number 2 are true, it explains why Mohg never succeeded in corrupting the process of Miquella's ascent. These 3 things are my main factors, and hopefully how they all tie or connect into the DLC in a similar way. So let's start with what has already been confirmed for the DLC directly by the creator of Elden Ring, Hidetaka Miyazaki. Miyazaki states that the cocoon and arm you saw at the beginning of the trailer is actually the point of entry to the Land of Shadow where the players will enter to the DLC area. This came from an IGN interview with Miyazaki and clearly states that Miquella's cocoon after defeating Mohg in Mohgwyn's palace is the access point for the DLC, and that Mohg directly stands in the way of Miquella's cocoon. However, in a separate Japanese interview with Miyazaki, he says the same thing. But I think in this interview, Miyazaki slipped up a little and accidentally said too much here, as he states that in addition to defeating Mohg, the players are also required to defeat Radahn as well to activate the DLC area. So just killing Mohg and getting past him to reach the cocoon isn't enough to activate this DLC. Radahn needs to be defeated in addition to Mohg. I really hope you've been paying close attention to my entire video so far, because if you have, that part about Radahn should be setting off some extremely loud sirens in your head right now. I should remind everyone at this time that might still be skeptical in my theory of the fact that Radahn is a completely optional boss in the main story of Elden Ring. You never need to kill Radahn, and you can beat the entire main story of Elden Ring without even meeting Radahn face to face. You are only required to kill Radahn to progress and achieve the specific Age of Stars ending with Ranni's questline. We already know, based on what I covered earlier, that the stars play some pivotal process in Miquella's ascent to godhood, but he is likely not the only one who is aware of this. Ranni is also clearly aware of the stars and their power via her ending that we can see and fulfill within the game. Ranni could be just as knowledgeable, if not more, when it comes to the stars compared to Miquella, since she's been surrounded by the Carrion family and her mother, the Queen of the Full Moon, for a majority of her life. An argument can be made that Ranni only needed us to kill Radahn to help break a hole into Noxtella with the meteorite and nothing more, but I wanted to include this segment of Smotown's lore video on Ranni, where I could never hope to put it as perfectly as he does.
Furthermore, the Fingerslayer blade item description itself states that it cannot be wielded by those without fate, and if fate is arrested, that means that Ranni wouldn't be able to wield this blade. So fate and destiny appears to be a power exerted by the stars onto the mortal plane, a power that is weaved into being through their movements. And ultimately I believe fate to be a tool of the stars. It ultimately seems like a way that they can guide their adherents. For example, we are still able to ascend the Elden Throne without killing Radahn, and therefore without the stars resuming their movement. This is why I believe fate is less of a wide-reaching, nebulous concept that affects everyone, and rather it is a force of control, of guidance, that is from the stars themselves.
Smotown perfectly describes what I believe is the key factor here, that these stars have an immense power that only few are acutely aware of, and that the movement of these stars can either determine one's fate completely, or even directly influence the fate of gods themselves. Ranni likely knew of these stars and their power, given that she's from the Carrion family, and Miquella has the wisdom of a god, which makes it equally likely that he would find this out too. You can even argue that a third party, being Radahn himself, knew of the power of the stars as well, since he too is also a Carrion much like his sister Ranni, and that Radahn would know that the movement of the stars could influence the fate of people, which the stagnant and resistant to change Radahn would never allow to happen, hence his grip over the stars and freezing them in place. This can be supported by the fact that Miyazaki said this DLC is accessible from Mohgwyn's palace after you defeat Mohg the Lord of Blood, but how he also mentioned that you need to kill Radahn. This shows that it should never be necessary to kill Radahn in order to reach the Lord of Blood, as you can only access Mohgwyn's palace that we find Miquella's cocoon in one of two ways. The first being the quest for Vare, which is the fastest method of visiting Mohgwyn's palace, and the only other method being the hidden portal in the consecrated snowfield. Both of these areas are extremely far from Radahn, and despite the Mohgwyn palace being located under Radahn's castle, it's not even directly accessible from Caelid, and it's not even possible to access Mohgwyn's palace from the crater that is formed after Radahn dies and loses his grip of the stars. Neither of these two methods are anywhere near Caelid, and also don't include Radahn needing to die. Depending on your playthrough, it's actually possible to visit Mohgwyn Palace, kill Mohg, and reach Miquella's cocoon before ever challenging Radahn in his festival. So, I hypothesize that Miyazaki wants us to kill Radahn, as stated in his interview, in addition to Mohg, because releasing Radahn's control over the stars in the skies is something that plays a significant factor in the events of the DLC, and something that I theorized earlier, that Miquella would know these stars needed to be free, as their movement plays an essential step in his ascent to godhood. We know that Malenia failed to kill Radahn, and failed to release his grip of the stars. But us Tarnished rise to kill Radahn, Malenia, and Mohg, making us the most suitable adversary to carry out Miquella's plan, since even his sister couldn't defeat Radahn. And that we would also kill Mohg, who stole Miquella's cocoon away from the Hailgtree in the first place, causing it to decay and interrupt Miquella's metamorphosis. Miquella would have to see us as Tarnished as extremely valuable to be used in his process of ascending to godhood, and he could either intentionally or unintentionally force us to help him, as he has always demonstrated a power of control or charm. Everyone by now should be aware of the Bewitching Branch's true power, which essentially charms someone and forces them to obey your every will, to the point where it makes complete strangers give their lives to you. Miquella would also never reject us as Tarnished, as only the Golden Order rejected those without grace. So something like the Albinarics, or even us as Tarnished, would be deemed worthy of Miquella's Hailgtree and support. It makes sense that Miquella would need us to follow him to the Land of Shadow to help fulfill his plan of metamorphosis or ascent to godhood that was already in its later stages before we got to him. Miquella would need our help, as he could be detached from his physical body, and how the developers stated Miquella has divested himself of his flesh, and that somehow in this Land of Shadow Miquella was searching for and likely found the final step to complete his ascent to godhood within this area, and for us to follow in his footsteps to find him. Whatever the specific reasons we are going to the Land of Shadow for, is likely because Miquella wants to use us, the player, to enact his final steps and help him ascend into a full god. This explains why the narrator in the trailer is terrified of Miquella's power, and why Miquella would want the help of a Tarnished, as well as how Miquella could use his power of control to ensure we would never betray him. But by now, I hope you may understand why exactly I believe Miquella is going to become a full god in the Shadow of the Erdtree DLC, and that he will likely have us do all the hard work for him, just like Malenia did. It's time for a Tarnished of all things to become the Blade of Miquella. Okay, I hope this was coherent enough for you to all understand, because this is my theory based on the trailer and the events of this game that I believe are fairly grounded and represented through the context of the trailer and directly towards the events in the base game of Elden Ring. I also want to add that this video was largely possible thanks to all the extra details Smowtown provides in his content. If it wasn't for his content piecing together the most intricate of details, I likely wouldn't have had the proper resources to string together my theory. So again, big shout out to all the work he does on his channel, which has directly influenced this video, and hopefully more if my theory ends up being accurate to some extent. I hope to revisit Messmer as well, since I believe that there's a lot more that can be said about Messmer after all the inferences I made in this video, as Miquella and Messmer are more or less parallels of each other in some significant way. But this video is getting long enough. So, as always, I'm Cyrobe, and I'll see you in the next video. Peace.